a few problems. I'm a little behind schedule, but today we're doing pistons, so let me show you. So I don't know how other people do this. I know a lot of guys get piston packs and they can put them all in at once, but since we're reusing these were used pistons. They had about 30,000 miles on them. And if you guys haven't seen the other videos, this thing blew a head gasket because the shop that rebuilt it did not cut the counter bores or did not have the deck straight. I got it straight on my own here at the house, and we're at 0.006, exactly where we need to be. Maybe a little high, but it'll be all right. I cleaned up all the pistons, cleaned everything up, and we're putting it back together. Now, one thing I don't like is this is not a Cat brand ring compressor. It's just some off-brand I got off eBay. Well, it's a little loose when you put it on, and it works, but it makes me nervous, and I don't want to break any rings, so I'm not an expert here. You can watch people like Adept Ape. He's definitely an expert, but when you set your rings up, you want them 180 degrees apart. Some people say that they line back up as they move up and down, but you know, still, we want to kind of set it up for success. Now, just be really careful with your oil ring if you have it apart, because it's difficult to get that back in the slot. And if you're wondering if it's not, you should be able to basically have it, you know, in line with the piston and not sticking out at all. A couple of other things to pay attention to. And all this was doing was sitting on a bench inside, and it still had quite a bit of rust. Unfortunately, this one's not so bad, but we can see some rust on these areas. So a good way to take care of that is just maroon Scotch-Brite. You can use 600 grit as well, but you know, don't go any more coarse than that. When it comes to these main bearings, or I'm sorry, rod bearings, do not lubricate the area where the bearing goes. Clean it with brake clean. Then you can also clean it with like a glass cleaner, because that leaves no streaks. But make sure this is super clean. And when you think it's clean, clean it one more time, because you want to make sure that the area where the bearing goes has no type of oil or lubricant. You don't want to spin a bearing. That's a bad day for everybody. But besides that, they just push right in place. And as long as it's clean and dry, you should be fine. Just make sure it's even. Here's one for that number 4, I think. And I just use engine oil to lubricate them. Now, Cat does say to use assembly lube, which is basically moly. And here's some of that. But you know, it lives in oil, and I think oil's fine. I'm not going to immediately start it. I will turn it over quite a bit to build oil pressure before I start it, because there's been so much work done to this motor. So in my case, I think engine oil is fine. The next thing is torque striping. So basically, you need to torque these to 66 foot-pounds and then 90 degrees. You torque your fasteners to 66, and by the way, these should be replaced every time you rebuild a motor. Torque them to 66 and then draw a line. Also draw a line on your socket, and then use that line on your socket to go an additional 90 degrees, and then draw another line. It's extremely important that you do that so that you can keep track of where you're at with the bolt and make sure that you follow the specifications. You can use an impact to get that extra 90 degrees. One thing I have noticed about this, since it doesn't compress all the way, it makes me worried. So I pay special attention, and instead of hitting it with, you know, the end of a hammer or whatever, you should be able to push these down. So when I get these rings exactly where I want, I then put a little bit of oil from one of these little oil containers. It's about 100 years old, still works great, clean engine oil. And I only oil this area here. And you should be able to push this down with your hand. You shouldn't need a hammer like a lot of guys use the butt of a hammer. I know they're not putting much pressure, but it's still pressure. As far as I'm concerned, I'd rather them go in as easy as possible. Now I do put my bearings on the rods. So I'll install the bearing on the rod beforehand, and I'll put the crank all the way up so that there's not much room for it to travel. Some guys don't do that. Some guys like to install the bearings in the truck, but I really just don't like to do that. That's about it for today. We will finish up all these pistons, and the next step is to clean everything up and put the head on.